So, are museum objects still necessary?
I hope so.
Yes.
This is going to be more of a discussion. I just have a few things to just kind of help set the stage, but I'm really curious to hear from all of you more than anything else. So, it's a little controversial, but this controversy actually, through a little bit of research, I found goes back at least back to the 1960s. And I'll actually show you the article and kind of give you some insights there. So, my name is Erik Bauer. I'm the archivist for the Peabody Institute Library in Peabody, Massachusetts. In addition to that, I am the archives manager at the Haverhill Public Library. I am an adjunct at Salem State University. And when I'm not doing either one of those three things, I also do independent consulting for historical societies in archival and collections management. So, from an archival point of view, more and more records that I am working with are born digital. These are including emails, these are including PDFs, these are including Word documents, text files, that sort of thing. I'm working less and less with physical items. The physical items I am working with are coming from things from years past, and when I say years past, I'm talking as early as, let's say, 20 years ago. So it's still not that long ago, but I'm still not, even though I'm still actively collecting and I'm collecting current materials, a lot of the current materials that I'm collecting are digital born. That also includes video, digital photographs, that sort of thing. There are fewer newspapers in print. More and more newspapers are going digital. So even then, I'm sort of saving web pages, or I'm saving things as websites and so forth. And also general ownership of materials is also going down overall. IKEA, of all places, is going to start renting furniture. That kind of gives you a little bit of insight as to sort of where we're heading in some ways. And then if you really want to take things to the extremes, you have things like Lyft and Airbnb and Uber, which even car and home ownership in some ways is, yes, you could do a rental as an Airbnb, but still that ownership is, and what is being passed on, or what may make its way to an historical society or a museum, things like that are decreasing. But on the museum side, the earliest reference I have to Are Objects Still Necessary goes back to 1968 with Dr. Wilkin Washburn, who was the curator for the Smithsonian Institute. In this article, it's a great article, it's an opinion piece, and if you can read it, but his basic premise is that do you really need an object at all? Yes, even if you describe an object and the museum were to fail, or if there was a nuclear holocaust or things like that, yes, some context may be lost of that object, but you can still garner and get information from that object. He also makes the point of photography. Now, granted, in the digital age nowadays, we can do things like virtual reality, things like that, where you can get more of a 3D, but this is 1968, and trying to get a man to the moon was still a more important thing. But his basic idea is a photograph is going to be more important. A photograph can work just as well as anything else. He also states that when you look at other types of museums beyond history, you're looking at natural history, you're looking at those type of things. You have rocks, materials, insects. You are going to be able to get the basic context and understanding from that just as much as, let's say, you have a coffee can or so forth. So he is trying to put it in a different context, and he does specifically say that this is a radical idea, but it's something to consider. And one of the quotes that from his article, or from his piece is, and I'll just go ahead and read it, historical items are subject to change. Dresses that the first ladies of the White House, once vibrant with color, are now, typo on my part, mostly uniform of a washed out white. Are visitors seeing the real thing? So and this is kind of goes to the heart of his idea of, are the objects in a collection still meaningful? If you're seeing it, but you're not seeing it with the true colors, if things are washed out, even though you can do conservation work, you can only do it up to a point. Now, to take this sort of to its logical conclusion, in 2010, Steve Cohn publishes Do Museums Still Need Objects? It's really more of a collection of essays rather than a sort of steadied, each chapter is almost an essay upon itself rather than a consistent argument. But one of the main arguments that he makes is here. and this comes from a book review that I found. Each chapter suggests a loss of objects in some way, if not physical loss, as in the case of repatriation, then the interpretive loss in which objects is increasingly secondary to political agenda, commercial interests, education reform, and so on. And it really is true. Even in my own institution, with what little exhibit space that I have and so forth, you really do kind of start to see that. I have to be very careful in the type of exhibits that I'm doing, the type of things that I'm putting out, because I have to be, yes, I am part of a public, the city of Peabody, so I can't get too political, but at the same time, I have to be careful on, am I being too commercial, or, what are the ramifications or blowback that I might have from putting an exhibit together. At the same time, my collection is now available to be searched online. I'm putting numerous materials on the Internet Archive. A lot of material is getting digitized. A lot of this material is now ORC, it can be searched. You don't even have to come into my institution to see a lot of my street directories and so forth. You can do it from the comfort of your own home. You're seeing exactly what I've just digitized. Is that basically just as good? Or is it still better to come in and see it? These are some of the sort of the questions that I've thought about over the past couple of years, and this whole session has come about through this digitization project, and has really kind of got me thinking. So I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of context in terms of where I'm coming from, sort of that sort of thing, and at the end, I'll give you my own personal opinion, but for right now, I'm really kind of curious to know kind of what do you think? Based on sort of what I've said, or in your own experiences or so forth, are we sort of getting to a tipping point where it's not as important to come into an institution anymore? Especially when you look at a lot of other institutions who are doing virtual exhibits, things like that. A lot of materials being made available online and so forth. So a lot of it you can even download. The Getty is a great example of that. The Library of Congress through the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. You can download those at no cost as high quality TIFF files or as PDFs. So who wants to who would like to disagree? Fight. Okay, I'll start here.
All right. Well, what I think is interesting about it is maybe the evolution in that it's important for communities in the same way libraries with their books are, because as we're becoming increasingly isolated, everybody looking at their laptops or their phones and things like that. So physical objects are a reason to go and see it.
Sure. Did you have your hand up? Okay, so, and then I'll keep going around the room this way.
I think there's both like a positive and a negative side to it. I did a project last year where I was researching material objects, and if I didn't have access to online databases where these collections were put online, my entire project wouldn't have been as thorough or in-depth as it was. But then you look at the aspect of when you go to a museum and you see this object in person, the history comes to life versus seeing it on a two-dimensional screen. Seeing the object there brings you to the place. Okay,
good points. All right, so
we have a lot of small sites, small museums. This is down Rehoboth, Mass, and Rhode Island, and our counts are going down of visitors because they can do the same thing online, and that's a problem.
Sure, and that is always going to be my focus over here.
So I think going to a museum and seeing an object can lead to you, encountering other people from different cultures, different places, even from your own neighborhood that you may have not met, and stumbling upon other objects that you may have not seen had you just looked for that object online.
So before I go to Mark here, I'm going to play devil's advocate and sort of use objects in a completely different way. The Craft and, well, they've just rebranded themselves. I think they're now Craft Contemporary. They were known as the Craft and Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles. I did an internship there many years ago. They got a grant many years ago to do, Objects Are Everywhere. And basically they took various objects and they put them in areas of Los Angeles that were, the grant called it culturally disadvantaged. So these are groups of people that would not necessarily go to a museum or be doing these things. And it was not necessarily as a way of getting people to go into the doors of the Craft and Folk Art Museum. It was a way of just basically engaging with the public. So again, it's sort of along those same lines of sort of working with others, talking with your neighbors, things like that, and running, but it was not in the traditional museum sense. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as sort of playing a devil's advocate in a way. So let me go up to Mark here.
Well, I can argue on both sides, so I'll have a fight with myself here. A couple years ago, I did a presentation on smallpox in Rhode Island for History Camp, and I was doing the research for that, and I OCR'd some digital copies of like Rhode Island records, and their own index was horrible. Like there was almost nothing in there that I was looking for, but after I had digitized it, you know, taken it and then did a search, I found all kinds of references to smallpox. It was very helpful.
Sure.
That is one thing about doing it digitally, is that you can do searches for things that, and you can use the information in ways that the person that originally compiled it never even imagined, you know. That, why would someone need to know about smallpox in, you know, 200 years from now?
Sure.
The other thing, though, is that I found a lot of serendipitous discoveries doing research. Like, so let's just say I was using, you know, some handwritten things that would be probably very difficult to digitize and do a word search on.
Sure.
You know, those records are digitized, but having the book in front of me and reading this and then spotting this over here and then, hey, wait a second. I never would have seen that if all I was doing was just looking at a digital record of this page. I never would have seen this page over here.
Sure.
And I think there's a lot to be said about objects and how people make connections with them. Like having an object from a particular time. I have a coin from 1803 I got when I was a kid, and you know, whenever I hear something happen in 1803, whether, you know, Louisiana Purchase or just some minor thing, I'm like, yeah,
Sure.
I have coins. People held that year, you know, and I think there's a physical connection that can be made that really brings history to life for people, not just for, you know, history nerds like us, but for the average person can get inspired by that object.
That's a good point. Okay, so I saw.
Which is a perfect segue to what I was going to say. So we at the House of the Seven Gables over the past year have been working on an interpretive and engagement plan of what is our next step? Because we have so many visitors who come into the site who say, I don't want a guided tour, I want to do this on my own, blah, 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 blah. So as soon as we started surveying our visitors over the past couple of summers and our busier seasons, and again, our demographic is everybody from like the super big brown furniture nerd
Sure.
to the begrudging spouse who's getting dragged along on a day in Salem who'd rather be at the bar drinking a beer. So it's, we got a wide demographic. But what we were shocked about in our surveying of people, and especially of a younger demographic, so kind of Gen X and millennial, is that people actually wanted to keep the guided tour experience in general. They felt there was more conversation, using objects in the house, being able to point things out and have that connection. And the other thing that totally floored us in our surveying is that people didn't want to see us put any technology into the house at the Seven Gables. And again, this didn't come from like the 20-year-olds who were like, I want to do tech. It was actually like our 20 and 30-year-olds who were like, this is my escape from technology. Like, I can put my phone in my pocket unless I want to take a picture. But I don't have to sit at a screen and read. I don't have to do anything. Somebody can just share the information with me. I can soak it in at my leisure.
Sure.
So just looking at kind of, again, that big wide demographic, and it was a really big surprise for us to see that not only is the museum and our objects necessary, but our people are very necessary in the museum as well to make those connections for people.
Sure, of course.
It was a good surprise, not a bad surprise.
Okay, so let's go you and then the gentleman back there, and then I'll keep going.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a broader point about how not everyone's technological experience is equal. So you could say, hey, we have VR, but like for a kid in inner city Boston who doesn't have the latest computer, they're not gonna have that, and they're not gonna have that experience. And so I think the conversation has to consider the broad use of technology and that not everybody has the same experience.
Exactly.
So therefore, I think objects are important. Would be my yeah.
Okay, so you've been waiting patiently, so.
Yeah.
Everyone else has, but I will be.
When answering this question, when thinking about it, what I kind of thought was kind of similar, I believe your name is Mark, what you said, and then kind of the last thing that you said. We're all kind of biased here because we all clearly enjoy history, and so we don't want our objects being taken from us. But the side that, I've been studying history and looking at history with my teacher, Mr. Sheehy, over the past few months is kind of like dealing with kids who really aren't that interested in history and how do we bring them into it. And I think that, while you can take an object digitize it, research it, get all this information, which makes it incredibly accessible and convenient, which is something you kind of touched upon.
Sure.
But that actual tangible artifact, even if it's just for a minute, you can kind of capture their interest just for that 1 minute, that's still kind of a step towards the final goal. And I think that while digitization really increases the overall convenience, because you don't need to be in like a history center or a museum to see the artifact. You could be anywhere in the world. Sure. When kind of dealing with how do we bring in more kids or more anyone of any age, I think artifacts or physical objects probably the number one way to do that.
And that's a good point. Okay, so
They all said what I was gonna
Oh.
say. No, but actually, I want to extend that a little bit.
Sure.
I think that it's very important to understand what is the purpose of each, because they both have a value. So that's number one. I want to give you 2 examples of something that really brings that out. One was when I was at the St. Louis Science Center. I was the director of science and galleries. And we had an astronomy gallery, as all science centers are wont to do.
Sure.
And if you've ever seen 10-year-old boys going through a museum, or excuse me, through a science center, because they have buttons, they run through and they push the buttons. And there was a family, and the father was trying desperately to get this kid to look at this thing.
Sure.
And so the kid is looking at it and says, look, I don't care. It's just, like somebody made a copy of it.
Yeah.
It's not, And the father said, no, that is the Gemini 6 capsule. This kid stopped dead in his tracks, and you could see the transformation happening. So the power of the primary object is not something to be taken lightly. What it does to us on a psychological level, in terms of grounding us and suddenly making that connection as you said, that object is very powerful. The second one, this is the one where you should take out your handkerchiefs and boxes of tissues, because this made me cry when it happened. I was working at Phillips Academy at the Peabody Museum there, and it's a museum that is dedicated to American archaeology. We ran a lot of field trips with kids from Lawrence, which you've got Andover, which is white and wealthy, and you've got Lawrence, which is not, and is a very multicultural community, and with a very high level of ESL students. In a field trip, we've got a group that is largely Dominican, and there's one Puerto Rican kid. And this is high school, they're all about 16 years old. So I see this kid as we're talking about these objects, and this kid is sort of sitting on the side, and he looks like, not bored, but depressed. Okay, so we cut everybody loose, and they're wandering around, and I walk up to this kid, and the whole conversation is taking place in Spanish. Anyway, so what he said to me was, I don't know where I am here. I don't feel comfortable. So I run downstairs, and I go up and bring a bunch of objects, and I had found out that this kid was from Puerto Rico. Brought up a bunch of objects from the Taino, which are First Nations people of Rico, and I'm talking with this kid one-on-one. At the end of that conversation, I've got a 16-year-old Latino male crying. They don't do that. This kid looked at me and said, nobody ever told me I had anything of worth. And these are my people.
Sure.
And this is my history. I mean, it's years later and I still got the goosebumps, but that power, what an object has the power to do. Okay, I heard that.
Okay, a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so here, I'll sort of skip, I'll go here and then, so.
But kind of bouncing off that, I used to volunteer in the summer at a little known museum at Great Lakes Naval Base, really tiny museum. So we had a lot of people come in that wanted to know, because our museum was centered around what the transition of civilian life to being a sailor, because we were on Great Lakes. And so we had a lot of people come in who wanted to know what their family, what their daughter, son, whatever, what they experienced during training. And we were not in a big, our museum is very tiny. And getting to see the displays that we had set up that showed how their life was, you know, at basic training, and getting to see their family members' faces like light up and going, wait, this is what so-and-so did, you know, this is how they slept, this is, you know, everything. It really, it was a satisfaction that I got to put, you know, I got to help set these things up so that these people could have this stronger connection to their family members. And what was even more moving was when we would get the people who served, who went through Great Lakes during World War II, or at the beginning when Great Lakes was founded in the early turn of the century, and seeing the look on their faces going, we didn't have that back then. Or seeing a map of the base and going, wow, this base is huge. And then hearing like their stories. And to me, that's the part that makes museums and objects necessary, is because you get someone to come in who saw, you know, who actually experienced whatever was firsthand, and that brings them, it flashes them back to when that happened to them, and all they want to do is talk about what they did. They don't want to talk about, you know, the food back then, which was a big thing, was people talking about, oh, the food is nowhere near as good as it is now. Or they want to talk about, oh, we had to sleep in these horrible, horrible stuffed cots. And everybody, they get the nice stuff now, or whatever. And just to see these older people come in and just talk about that. It's like, I never got to experience that. To hear that, for me, it makes it necessary. Because it gives them a chance to tell their story. And they don't feel like they get to tell it that often.
So you've been waiting, and I'll kind of go back.
So I think that when talking about this, to kind of backtrack and just take the digitization and technology piece out of it entirely.
Sure.
Do people still want to go to museums?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that everyone who's currently working in museums is asking themselves. And I would say yes, because when you go on vacation somewhere and you're walking around, one of the things that you do in that area is you go to a museum. And you may not even been planning to go to that museum. You're walking around, you see a museum, and you think, we're on vacation, let's go in. And that's the piece of, you know, are people still engaging and going into a museum? But then along with that, you know, so we're from the Salem Witch Museum. We don't have many artifacts. In fact, I can count the amount of artifacts we have on one hand. And that's because the Salem Witch Trials have very few artifacts. So for the past 50 years, the way that we've been teaching the Salem Witch Trials is through interpretation of the court documents, that you go into an auditorium and we tell you the story and you watch as the story happens around you. And we consider ourselves a museum. And that's one of the questions that we're constantly having with the community around us is, do they consider us a museum? And it's a debate, you know, it's one of those things, but is it the fact that we have any artifacts, does that make us any less a museum? And with continuing that conversation, we physically can't have artifacts because I can't go back to 1692 and make something that, you know, and bring it back into the future, you know? So I mean, part of what we do is we're currently growing a collection because we've had opportunities to acquire certain artifacts, but it's not vital. We don't have to have artifacts to tell the story and to have people engage with the history. And we have visitors leave all the time who say, you know, I didn't know that, or I understand this on a different level now, or I have related to these people in a way. And part of what we talk about is what a witch hunt is and how that relates to 1692 and how that relates to today. And the gratifying part about our job is having people walk out of the exhibit and say, I would never have thought of it that way. Thank you for doing that. And that's nice, and that's why we continue doing it. But you know, to bring history into the modern day and have it be relevant and important and engaging, you know, without a collection, that's something that we do every day. So I mean, the question of whether or not do artifacts matter, I think is a bigger question of what makes a museum, and is a museum without artifacts. You know, I'd love to have something that someone could look at and really connect with, but at the same time, if you physically can't,
Sure.
what do you do?
Right. So the two things, I'll go over here, but the two things I'll just real quick. Again, going back to the Craft and Folk Art Museum, they are AAM accredited, American Alliance of Museums accredited, but they have no permanent collection. they only have rotating exhibitions that last anywhere from 6 months to a year. So it actually is possible to actually be considered a museum and have absolutely nothing in their collections.
Yeah.
So they do have that. And in terms of visiting museums, if you follow the numbers, if you read Museum News, which is published by the American Association for State History, at some point, I can't remember, they always publish it at least once a year. They sort of give the same spiel, from rightly or wrongly, based on their numbers and so forth. But there's a significant number of historical sites. And they define it as basically, are you a history museum? Are you just a historical house? Are you engaging in history in some way? And the one thing that they always say is, or almost always say, is that numbers generally for these type of sites are up, and that a significant number of people are going to these types of museums, historic houses, historic sites, things like that. So you are correct in that there is a number of, of course, they don't necessarily break down how many are from out of town, things like that, but they do specifically state I can't remember what the last issue was that mentioned it, but there, however many thousands or millions of people are going to, history-related museums, and the number actually, in a lot of, depending on communities and so forth, in some areas exceeds that of art museums and so forth. So it is, so people are doing that, and you are correct. So let me go over here. So let's go here, and there.
So I think, first of all, I've been touched by the things that people are saying about the amazing experiences people have had in their museums. It's so fun. We all know that museum people have those stories, and it's so wonderful to hear them. But I think that a lot of us also feel that tension of, we understand why you can't get the same experience from a digital reproduction of an artifact as the real thing. It gets complicated when the digital version is the real thing, because it was a born digital thing. But there's a value proposition issue, and that feels so buzzwordy, but like, how do we explain to the public, the dabblers, the non-history nerds, if this object is online, it's because someone is taking care of it and someone is keeping it there for the people who are gonna have the in-person experiences. This is additive, it's not competing. It costs money to take care of it, it costs money to put it online, it costs money to have your doors open to bring people in. How do we, I'm not the first person to ask these questions, I just wanted to make sure that they're a part of this conversation about, do we still need museums? Because we know we do. I think we also still need digitization and making sure that people using these resources understand how they fit together is hard, and I don't know the answers, but I just wanted to ask the question. And while I'm speaking, I also wanted to put in a side note. You mentioned Digital Commonwealth. I'm on the board of Digital Commonwealth, and we're currently looking for more committee members and so if anyone is interested or you have questions about Digital Commonwealth, please feel free to find me. I'm happy to be a resource for that. And our committees are membership, outreach and education, repository committee, and our conference committee. And our conference is coming up in April. So lots of ways to get involved, lots of reasons to ask questions as well.
I think it sounds like a consensus is that both are necessary. They both have a role, both the archival digital reach, which is so broad, versus the power of the thing. As you said, now exhibits have to be sort of relevant and politically charged to almost have validity in a sense. And yet, that does give the opportunity to also have something that's a little more esoteric or a little bit more on the fringes. And I think it's important to keep those artifact-based or object-based exhibits as best you can. And thank goodness, that was great news for the House of Seven Gables that people actually do want to still come to the spaces where things happen, even if it's a recreated space or a changed space, but it's still a space, but the artifacts. I think the message that I'm trying to sort of get around to is, it sort of just escaped me. What everybody else has said has been so important. And it will come back, but it'll come back in just a moment, so I'm gonna let that pass.
Okay, so you were next to
So
speak up,
A little louder.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, as a future archivist, I think digitization is almost somewhat necessary just because we have such fragile objects, and it's, you can't handle those things and stuff all the time, because otherwise you're gonna lose them. So I think digitization in that part goes hand in hand with the museum, in that it's helping to save the artifacts, as well as telling you there's other artifacts you can go see that are in the museum. But on a separate note too, I think museums give a different feeling to learning the history. So, example, Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. It's a lot different going in there and experiencing the story there than looking at the artifacts online. I think you get a lot more out of it by being in that controlled mindset. Besides being at home, looking on a laptop with kids running around, dogs barking, all that kind of stuff going on. So I think that's almost why museums might still be.
And to follow up, which goes right along with that and everything else, I think it's why museums do have an important role to be proactive and not just do the politically relevant message, which is crucial, that they have to be a part of life, but to also take possession of that history, which is our mission, and introduce it, project it to those who may not know that they're going to experience that. It's the surprise element. I'm having a group of people coming in. They are social media influencers. So as I was strategizing about what we would talk about, she said, oh, no, they don't want to hear the history. No. But part of our role, I think, is to introduce to somebody who may not think they don't want something, that they will actually find that interest in it. And then how are the ways that we do that? How do we make that past interesting? That brown furniture or all the different things that people aren't supposed to like anymore. How can we make that interesting? And especially, I just came from the session on the media and the newspapers before the revolution, how they shaped current events. Sure. The media is doing that now. Museums, I think, have to be a part of that and how they shape the experience of people experiencing the past.
So one thing before I get to you, and that is, so you brought up something that interesting, sort of when you have to preserve something or and whatnot. But that also then gets into the question of reproductions. Is a reproduction just as good? Is a reproduction, it's not the original. For example, I have in my collection in Peabody, I have letters from Washington, Hamilton, Alexander, John Jay, a dozen from Benjamin Franklin that were given to George Peabody. George Peabody didn't have any use for them, so he gave them to the library. We don't have security to be able to display these. So the closest thing I can do is to basically make a copy of it and then display that and so forth. Even if a patron wants to handle it, it's still too fragile because of the original binding to let somebody look through it. So now the other question becomes, now we've all talked about, many of you have mentioned that, yes, handling that object and so forth is important, and I don't disagree with you, but where does things like reproductions come into play? Because you're not seeing the original. You're seeing a replicant of it. So I'm going to go you and then you.
Just very quickly, I'm not a professional in this field, but I want to pick up on what you were saying, which is that I believe that I'm a big consumer of museum attendance and experience, and I just want to say that people learn differently, and different people learn differently. And I was one of the worst history students of the honors class I was in high school, but as an adult, I'm fascinated. So the way to engage me is not by reading a book from, that was printed before 1940 in my small classroom in Vermont. The way to get to me is to go there and hear people talk about it and see the things. And for me, whether they're copies or not, my opinion's not really relevant. But I just want to say, you've got a really broad audience when you're talking about a place where people come off a cruise boat and in Salem Harbor and walk over, or they've made a life pilgrimage.
Right. Okay, so.
There's so many things to respond to, and for me, the visceral touching is very personal. I remember getting into tears touching a tombstone of a woman that I had never met. She was like my grandmother. But struggling with the House Museum, since we've gone through the facsimiles,
to what extent do we, to me, a lot of the powerful stories in here are when the learning is mediated.
Sure.
By somebody being a docent, by signage, and to what extent do you put that in there to enhance the experience so people can, even the docents who might not know who made that particular picture can run over and see a peek at the sign, you know, or do you do that? And for us, one of the things we're grappling with right now is to what extent do we need to change up what we're doing at the Old Ordinary in Hingham. And we have, for instance, some samplers. We have a wonderful collection of samplers. A lot of them were done, or all of them really were done at the old Derby, but at the Derby Academy. And some of them are fairly critical to the experience, especially having the fifth graders come through. They tell story of the family histories and that kind of thing. We talk about them, and they're getting fragile because they're displayed. So our discussion right now is that an example of something that we should do the best facsimile we can, put it on the wall, and maybe the fact that we can show people, and this would get to your documents, you can show people, we have the originals, you can tell people we have this one, but for you to be able to experience it, we have to do the facsimile. We will still have lots of authentic samplers, but because we think the story about this particular one is so important and we want to preserve it and not lose it, to what extent is it okay to make some of them facsimiles? And I welcome discussions about that.
We used to call those education collections.
Yeah.
Comment.
Oh, yes.
Well, I would just react to what you're saying, and I work for the trustees of reservations, and we've been introducing reproductions and working with partners like North Bennett Street School and have okay, let's make a reproduction of Emerson's desk and chair so that people can sit down in the old manse and look out the window, or let's deconstruct a piece of furniture and with a carpenter and see how difficult it is to make these joints. So that's what the curation team is doing. I work in the archives, and what I found is the digital world has expanded our stories. People are finding us and coming to us with their stories, and that then I can then pass those stories on of people growing up on the farm, or people, workers working the land and that sort of thing. And then I can, pass on those stories to the interpreters on the space. We work with Digital Commonwealth. We will never be able to digitize everything. So people will always have to come in and see what we have. We can just send out samples of the different properties and, hope that's a beginning for their learning. And what we find is that people not only give us back the stories, but also share. Digital sharing has now become something where they will allow us to scan or take their photos to add to our digital collection, which is fabulous.
Before, I'll just say one thing, and this goes actually to the Haverhill Public Library. Right now they're doing a huge digitization project with their photograph collection. They're digitizing about 50,000 photographs that Northeast Document Conservation Center is doing. And their photo cataloger is, going through, and they're putting all these photos up on, they're putting all their photos up as they come back and being cataloged. And there are people who are just writing in, emailing them, and specifically her, with mistakes in the catalog record. They're not looking at the original. They're not looking at the actual photograph, but they notice that, oh, this photograph was actually taken on this street looking this way, or this house has been misidentified, it's actually this house instead, and that sort of thing. So in a lot of, yes, being able to actually physically see something is good at the same time, but also you can sort of say within the digital realm, you also can be in a position where you can learn from your public as well, with corrections and errors and so forth. And the photo cataloger, she's absolutely phenomenal, has done an incredible job, but she can only go with what she has, or what she's been able to interpret from the original. And other people, just whether it be in Haverhill or in the surrounding area, have been able to help correct and update these various catalog records. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. We have about 5 more minutes, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with regards to reproductions at least, I think there's something to be said if you have the actual object, you're able to get better reproduction. And I think museum goers, whether they're history people or not, are gonna understand the fact that we need to be able to preserve those. But if you have a reproduction that's 98% close to the real thing, I think people will still be able to get that same satisfaction out of it. And then putting in, like on a sign somewhere, a caveat saying we have the original, but it's such a popular item, we need to be careful with it. Here's a reproduction. I think people will understand that.
Oh, yep. One thing that it's kind of interesting, so a friend of mine in Ireland is, he laser scanned a Celtic cross. And obviously he can't, it's huge, right, so he can't take it in, but they're using it for two purposes, right, so they have it in a museum, but also they're able to assess the impact of climate change on how, how it's changing.
Did you guys have to say?
Yeah, I have a mobile Black History museum, so I bring a lot of artifacts around to colleges, prisons, elementary schools, and all that. There's nothing, like you were mentioning, that how quickly intimate you can create a relationship with someone. I don't know what to put on my table, from the Jackie Robinson doll to, a slave brand. Very visceral reactions that people get from objects. At the same time, I would argue that, like J.L. Bell put on a 1775 blog, he put a Boston Massacre picture that had the engraving from Paul Revere, I think the original one, and showed a colored Crispus Attucks that I would never have thought of or seen unless he had said, and look at this also, this copy of this original, or this, I went to the TIFF, I went to the high resolution and zoomed in on it. And especially for minority historians and just average consumer of history, it's about, what do you use the history for? Because Black folks are often in the margins, like I teach genealogy also. Sometimes we're literally in the margins of censuses. And you can't see that unless if you have a really dynamic curator in the museum who's pointing those things out, that is great, that's gold, but you can't do that unless you're online.
Sure.
So I think it's really, how dynamic the setup is, digital or physical.
Sure. And that is very true. Yes.
I'll just say for the museum people and duplication and things like that, a lot of sculpture is duplicated so many times from the original. And we're seeing that in museums across the country. So that I can go to a museum here in Boston and see the dancer, and that's a duplication, and it's, people are seeing it all across the country in other museums and thinking that that's the original, unless you know to, learn more about it and understand that sculpture itself is duplicated originally.
Right.
But it still has power.
I can follow up on that. About 20 years ago, a lot of art museums started digitizing collections, not for the purpose of putting them online for people to look at as for research purposes or whatever, but to sell them as marketing devices. They became tied into, and the Guggenheim was really good about this. You could buy a screensaver of, pick a painting, or whatever. So they became marketing devices, and that was a very different and very controversial way of utilizing both collections and digitization.
Right.
So I don't know where that fits in anymore.
Exactly. So the one thing I will say, so I promised you, if we're answering those up, I promised you I'd sort of give you my 2 cents. My 2 cents is very much like what all of you have said. There's a place for digitization and so forth, and making things available online, but there is something about the physical. And one example that stands out in my mind is about 4 years ago, we had to go under major renovation in Peabody. The roof truss in the original building collapsed or broke. And so my office moved from right next to the stacks to right off of the teen room. And so I'm doing an inventory of the photograph collection, and they get curious about what's in these Hollinger boxes, and they ask. So I pull out a photograph of center school, which is where these were middle schoolers. But many of them went to this school, so they got to see what the kids will look like, what they were dressing like in about 1910, and what the school looked like back in that time, because the building had actually been demolished and rebuilt. And that led into various postcards, and that led into other things. So it was spontaneous learning. It wasn't planned. It was just their own curiosity of me carrying all these boxes down and wondering, what I was doing with them. So there is a place for both. But like I said at the very beginning, it's been ever since I read that article by Washburn, I've always kept around that idea, sort of taking what he said to its logical conclusion. So I just want to thank you all for your thoughts and for this discussion. And then if you have any other questions or things like that, that's on email, Twitter, and Instagram as usual. Thank you very much.